Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be continuing our exploration of the Velimerovic attack and how to play it with the white pieces. And if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and please click on your notification icon. So we're going to continue exploring after e4, c5, knight of 3, d6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight of 6, knight c3, and we're going to be going into the Velimerovic via this classical move order, knight c6, bishop c4. We're going to have e6, bishop back to b3, bishop e7, bishop e3, queen a6, queen e2, queen c7, castles, queenside, castles, kingside, rook hg1, and this kind of begins our Velimerovic attack scenario. So, last time I discussed that b5 was the main line, and then white should respond with pawn to g4. And I mentioned this move, pawn to b4, and I mentioned that if we wanted to continue playing for a win, we could just play knight c6, queen c6, knight d5. We could also just play knight d5 immediately, and I also mentioned the possibility of g5, which currently leads to a perpetual. But there is actually another option here that I didn't have a chance to discuss, so I'm just going to go over that real quick. G5 is actually more of a go than I thought it was initially, and it's because there's a move in here that I didn't know about where white could potentially continue to play for a win. So after b4 and then g5, we would have bc3, gf6, bishop f6, queen f3, takes, king b1, and I mentioned that, okay, well, we have this threat of queen f6, so really the only move is king h8. Also, bishop e5 is possible, but then we could just play h4 and just white has enough compensation for the material. So we're going to have king h8, and then really I gave two lines, both of which led to perpetual. I gave e5, which is kind of a very complicated way of going to the perpetual. They have to find the correct move on the next move, otherwise they're lost. They have to find knight takes d4, and then after rook d4 takes, we can either sack the queen right away, queen takes f6, gf6, bishop h6, which leads to this bishop g7, bishop h6 perpetual, or we can put it off by one more move. We can play rook c4, queen b7, but then after queen b7, the computer says we have nothing better, we just need to sack the queen here, and then gf6, bishop h6, and then this eventually leads to perpetual check. Even if rook g8, we just have rook g8, king g8, rook g4, and then bishop h6, bishop h7, bishop g7, bishop h6, etc. We just repeat, we walk back and forth. And of course, the other line had a similar issue, which is after knight c6, there didn't appear to be a way to avoid this perpetual. Queen c6, and then we could play, really, we could even just do it right here. We could just play queen f6, gf6, bishop h6, and this leads to perpetual check. But there is this possibility to play for a win that I missed, and, you know, in my defense, everybody missed it. But I did mention this line deserved further exploration, so I spent a couple of days further exploring this line, which is really what you're supposed to do. And you could actually play for a win with bishop h6, and then after rook g8, you can of course force a perpetual with queen takes f6, but bishop g5 is a very real move here. And white can continue to play for a win from here. The whole point is after bishop g5, rook g5, we're putting pressure on this f7 pawn, which is now undefended. And it's a wide open position for white to attack, and this actually does mean something, that black's defense is actually very awkward. So let's say, for example, queen c7, we can continue with rook h5 with the immediate threat of mate in 2, like rook h7, king h7, queen h5 mate. And at this point, the computer actually starts really liking white's position. It starts saying that white's doing a little bit better than equal here. It starts saying this was maybe just slight edge white, because there's not a whole lot of ways that black can meet rook h7, king h7, queen h5 as a threat, so he needs to push a pawn. He needs to play something like g6. Then we can continue with queen f6, rook g7, and now, of course, we actually have the option to force a perpetual here, using kind of a crazy move. We can play rook c5, which forces perpetual check. So we still have that perpetual in the bag. We can play rook c5, and then if they take with the pawn, obviously rook d8 is a big problem. They would have to sack their queen. But if they take with the queen, then we just have this cute little perpetual queen d8, queen f6. And that's just totally quality. So at this point, after rook g7, if we want to continue playing for a win, we can actually just play rook h3. And this is actually supposed to be slight edge white. White's actually getting his material back. An example would be like bishop b7. We go rook d3 going after this d6 pawn. And then say rook d8, we would continue with rook d4, simply to hold our pawn on e4. h5, we would continue with f4, followed by f5, trying to break down the position of the pawns in front of the black king. And because of how dangerous this all is, eventually black is just going to be forced to give us back the pawn on e6. So like, let's say king h7, bishop back to b3, back, takes, bishop takes e6, and now we've gotten our material back, and clearly we're still attacking, so this is slight edge white. So I would actually recommend this path to go down. It's completely unexplored, nobody's ever played it, and it looks like this is the way to go in terms of how to play for a win from that previously discussed position where they play an early b4. I just recommend going into this line with g5, and just remember this little rejoinder with playing bishop to h6, and then simply bishop back to the g5 square. After rook g8, we play bishop g5, and we play for a win. So that's my solid recommendation for that, and I would say now's a good time to go into the wild complications of the main line. So the main line starts with knight d7, and then knight f5, and this is wild and crazy stuff. So the main stem game that everybody kind of cites with this, with knight f5, is a game played between Ginsburg and Alanka. So we're going to go over that. And then there's another game that we can take a look at, another game played by Lanka, a game between Sokolov and Lanka. And these games were played in back in the 90s and the 80s, so they were played quite a while ago. But basically, the main idea behind knight f5 is if pawn takes knight on f5, we would play knight d5. So, like, just to give you an example, so pawn takes d5, we would play knight to d5, bringing our knight to a strong square, and then we would play gf5, and these positions aren't even really debatable. This is just advantage white all day long, and it's huge advantage white. We have tons of compensation for one piece. We have the open g file, we have massive threats against the black king, but we also have threats like they can't bring this knight to e5, for instance. We have threats of playing something like bishop b6. So big problems here. Okay, so this isn't even something that we should debate. We shouldn't be taking this knight. So the question is, what should black be doing in this position? So we come back to that kind of classic game where they played bishop b7, and bishop b7 is still considered the theory today, and then white plays pawn to g5, basically daring black again to take this knight and saying, if you take this knight, knight d5 is going to be a thing. But also now I'm threatening to improve my position. I'm threatening to play moves like queen h5, I'm threatening to play moves like rook g3 to h3, and even in some instances I can push this pawn again. I can play g6, and I can start trying to open up the position along this diagonal with these weakened pawns on the e6 square, etc. So g5 is a good move to continue to play for an improvement, and since we still don't want to play e5 as black, we need to come up with some sort of move here that we can play. So knight c5. We're bringing our knight out, we're protecting our bishop on e7, we're putting pressure on the bishop on b3. So then the next move is, of course, considering the situation, very logical. We play bishop d5. And now absolutely everything in the position is hanging. We have our bishop hanging on d5, we have our knight hanging on f5, and neither one of them can really be captured. If we capture either one of these pieces, it's going to lead to a huge advantage for white in this particular situation. So we have a couple of moves here. Like the main line is the highlighted move. The move rook f to c8 is actually the main line. But the game that often gets cited here is that Ginsburg versus Lanka game, where Lanka tried the move knight e5. And this move, knight e5, really highlights the danger of white's plan, and it's also, it just shows exactly what white is playing for. After knight e5, Ginsburg played f4, we had knight back to g6, and then we have queen h5. So the basis of white's strategy at this point is just to play rook g3 to h3. And that's one of the big reasons that, rook f8 earlier is kind of, rook f to c8 earlier is kind of a big part of this position for black, because black really wants to be able to shuffle that knight back to f8. Now, in this Ginsburg versus Lanka game, black did eventually shuffle his knight back to f8, but he made the error here of playing pawn to b4 first. And this was just a tempo that he couldn't afford. And then after rook g3, he has to make a defensive play here. He doesn't have time to play any of the captures. So you see, now we have officially almost all the minor pieces are hanging. We have 3 pieces that are under attack by pawns, and none of them can be captured by black, because right now we're just simply threatening a mate in 2. We're threatening to play rook h3 followed by queen h7 mate. So black needs to spend time to cover that. So the move that got played was rook f c8, so that he can play knight f8 to cover that threat on h7. So rook h3 got played, and then knight f8 covering the threat on h7. So we have 3 pieces in this position hanging. So what's white to do? It looks like white's going to start losing material because the mate threats have been covered. Well, obviously we're not going to start moving anything back. We're just going to keep attacking. So the next move was bishop d4, putting additional pressure on the g7 square. At this point, it becomes very, very difficult for black to find a good move because none of the captures seem to be sufficient. But he has to start capturing something because he's got to start clearing some of these attacking pieces. But if he were to capture on, say, c3, he would be instantly losing to the move queen h6, with basically the threat of queen takes g7 mate, and there's 2 pieces that are supporting it. So even if you take one of those supporting pieces, the other supporting piece will allow the queen to g7 mate. And of course, if you noticed, the move gh6 is possible, but the move knight takes h6 is immediately checkmate. So queen h6 is a threat, and we have to meet that threat. So when black chose his capture, the capture that he chose was to meet the threat of queen h6. Right? So he can't play bc3, so then that leaves 2 options. He can take the bishop or he can take the knight. Now, if he takes the knight, he gets mated into another way. He gets mated into like this, which is... So what does that leave? That leaves one more piece that he can potentially take, and so that's what he did. He took this way. So the idea is now he can meet the move queen h6 with the move knight on 5 to e6, for example. But Ginsburg has a very easy move to play here. He captures, he plays bishop takes g7, and that sets up a new threat. That sets up the threat of knight h6, followed by queen f7, queen g8 mate. So now that threat needs to be met. So bishop to d8 got played to cover that f7 square, and then the white bishop simply retreated, threatening now knight h6 checkmate on the spot. f6 was forced. gf6 threatening both rook g1 and rook g3. They had to cover the g-file, so knight g6 got played. f7 resigns. And the reason they resign after f7 is if king captures, we have queen h7 leading to mate. And if queen takes f7, we have knight h6, forking king and queen, winning the queen. So this game is basically over at this point. So that's a really good game to remember in terms of just understanding what your basic plans are as white, even if your opponent doesn't necessarily play this particular line. So going back, what is the recommendation in this wild, crazy, we're going to sack all of our pieces line? So what is the recommendation for black? Well, the main recommendation here is simply rook fc8. We're going to play that first, and then white's going to play the exact same plan. He's going to play queen h5, rook g3, rook h3. So we're going to play queen h5 first, because we don't want to play rook g3 and have black be able to preemptively play g6. So now there's 2 possibilities here for black. Black can play either g6, or black can play the move knight to e5. Now right now the main line is knight e5 with kind of the same idea of, okay, we can shuffle this knight back to g6 and back to f8, with the major difference being that we haven't committed any tempo to the move pawn to b4, and therefore we should be okay. We should be 1 tempo ahead of losing. So the other way to play this is we could play the immediate g6. In this case, you should play knight h6 check, king g7, and you should shuffle this queen back to f3, because after queen f3, you're hitting that f7 pawn, and this is going to force a defense, and this is actually going to lead to a pretty wild position. This is going to force knight e5 to defend it, and then you're just going to play bishop d4 and create a pin. They can play f6. You're going to go ahead and shuffle your queen out of the line of fire at that point with queen e3, which also sets up f4. At this point, they can take your bishop, but you can also play f4, and that knight cannot move. If that knight moves, black is getting destroyed. So after knight takes e4, you're going to go ahead and you're going to bring this knight back to f5 with check, and the knight on f5 can't be captured because black will be getting mated. So then king g8, now you're going to rip that piece on e5, takes on e5, and now this bishop on d4 is definitely under legitimate threat at this point, so you're going to have to move it. You're going to have to get that knight out of the line of fire as well, and then you're going to take on d5, and now the dust is finally settled with all the pieces that were just being sacrificed. And this position is approximately level. It's pretty unclear. Both sides can still play for some sort of something. I would prefer white here. White has just slightly better pieces in this position, and white can feel comfortable in just trying to continue to play for a win from here. So that's kind of where the theory sits right now on g6. The other possibility is knight e5, in which case we're going to play very similar to that previous example, f4, knight g6, and we're going to continue with a number of different moves here. So we can continue with rook g3 if we want. Sokolov against Blanca actually tried the move knight takes g7, and he went on to win after king g7 and f5, and then some more serious complications. Went on to win that game, but I would hazard you here that if you play knight g7, the computer gives b4 in this position as completely winning for black. It gives like a +3 point assessment for black, so black should, in theory, be coming out ahead in these complications. But of course, the positions are still incredibly, incredibly complicated. So basically, a couple of moves that you can play here is you can play rook g3 is reasonable. And then after, say, bishop d5, you can play rook h3, knight f8, and you can play knight e7, queen e7, e takes d5. It's supposed to be a playable position, and it's relatively unclear. I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. But probably the best, according to theory right now, is just to play bishop takes b7, knight takes, and then play knight takes e7, queen takes e7, and then continue now with rook g3. And this should just be slight edge white. I don't think this should even be debatable. I think this is just slight edge white, and you can continue to play for a win from here all day long. Black is by no means losing like he was in the Ginsburg versus Lanka game, so he's doing okay as well, but white has plenty of ways to continue to play for this very nice and very straightforward kingside attack, so this should be considered slight advantage white, and this should definitely be considered the way to go. So the only other kind of line that we need to worry about within the Velimerovic, just so I can close out my Velimerovic series, is if we go back to all of this stuff. It is actually possible, and quite a few people do it, they will omit b5 here, and they will instead play the move knight a5, and then after g4, they'll follow with b5. So in this case, all they're really trying to do is just get rid of this bishop on b3 kind of ahead of time. And I would recommend g5 here. Knight b3 check usually gets played. A b3, knight d7. And now the main theoretical move is, again, another sacrifice, is you should play knight to f5. In this position, interestingly enough, probably like the only move that really gets tried according to theory is taking this knight. So they take it, you play knight d5, queen d8, and then e takes f5. So this is actually a really difficult position for black to defend. Knight e5 could be met with bishop to b6, and we also have threats of f5 to f6, which would lead to a significant improvement in white's position. So the only other question is, well, what does black do in this type of position? And the answer is he needs to play rook e8, which is the best move according to theory. Now, in the old days, only two moves really got tried. Those moves were f6 and queen f3. And then, actually, way back when, I started playing g6 as a third attempt to try to play for a win in this position with white. Now, of course, with the advent of modern computers are telling me that g6 is just nothing better than equality. It's just nothing better than perpetual. So after g6, let's just say they exchange everything. The immediate knight e5 apparently signaled that white has nothing better than just ripping on g7, king g7, rook g1, and then after some king move, queen h5 check leads to some sort of perpetual check. That's what the computers are telling us now. And even retreating the rook, like rook g2, rook g3, you get met with bishop tempoing. So like rook g3 is met with bishop h4, rook g2 can be met with even just bishop h3. So you would be left, if you wanted to play for a win, trying to play the rook all the way back to g1, but after bishop f5, after queen h5, queen d7, you apparently, again, have nothing better than going for this perpetual after rook g7. So you're left kind of right back in the same spot from a theoretical perspective. So the question is, from a theory perspective, if you have this position, is there a way that you can play for a win with white? The answer to that is yes. Queen f3 is the move. Queen f3 is the way to go here. And then after the computer best move, which is bishop f8, you should play knight to f6. And this is the idea. So after knight f6, and they play knight f6, you're not going to take the rook on a8, you're going to take on f6. But because the rook on a8 is hanging, they need to spend a move to defend against that. So they need to play a move like d5. And at this point, so there was another game, there was actually a game that went rook takes e3 here. and then it continued f takes e3, d5, and then takes on g7, and then bishop e7, and then that game continued poorly. White actually made a mistake in this position, but white is completely winning after pawn to f6. So an example would be bishop f6, rook f1, x-raying the bishop with the f7 square, king g7, rook d5 is completely, utterly just demolishing all of black's defenses. So like queen e7, rook h5 is just a totally winning attack. Bishop b7, queen f4, we're threatening queen h6, queen h7, and we're checkmating. Or queen h6 followed by rook g1. So this is just completely over, and it should be viewed that way. After pawn to after rook e3. So the alternative is pawn to d5 immediately, which leads to a similar outcome. Like white should be winning here after bishop d4. So after bishop d4, you would have something like rook e4, and then rook takes g7 should be completely winning. So like rook g7, bishop g7, queen g2 is a completely winning attack for white. So that's how we meet that knight a5 followed by b5 option right now. According to theory, in this critical position, the queen f3 move, according to the machines, is leading to advantage white. And after the computer top pick here, it's not just leading to advantage white, it's leading to major advantage white. So that's it. That's how we play the Velimerovic attack with the white pieces. These are the main lines that we have to choose from. And I hope that you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.